We now come to item number 9, I think, on the agenda, which is the Mayoral Housing Task Force. Penny Pruitt is at the top of the table as Director of Regulatory Services. This is to update everybody on the governing body on what the Mayoral Housing Task Force has been doing, where it's got to, where it's still got to go to. So, Penny, if I can ask you to introduce, well, I'll move it pro forma. I think the Deputy Mayor wanted to second that. Penny, ask you to introduce it, then we'll take questions and comments.
Thank you. So, as the Mayor has indicated, this is an update report on behalf of the Mayoral Task Force. The Task Force, as you were aware, was set up earlier on and has had 4 meetings over the last year. It's made up of a group of highly skilled senior people from the building and construction industry, from the non-profit sector and housing, design, economics, finance, and central and council officials are also on it. It's a highly engaged group of people, and I think the thing that's been most powerful about the task force is that there is a general consensus across all of those different areas of Auckland who work in the housing space on what are the challenges that Auckland faces, but also on what are the actions that need to take place. There's been a number of subgroups who have been working outside of the task force regular meetings, and they've been focusing on issues that were identified by the task force as the key focus areas: construction procurement and contracting processes, skills and capability, medium density and building code reform, and infrastructure funding. And from those subgroups, there's a real clarity of what are the actions that are needed to be progressed and what are the key messages that need to happen down to Wellington, because many of these issues are not things that Auckland alone can tackle. They do need the collaboration, cooperation and leadership down in Wellington as well as in Auckland. And I don't think we can underestimate the impact of having such a highly skilled group of people all on the same page about what our challenges are, but also what messages and actions need to happen, because they have their own conversations across the industries, but also down in Wellington. So just some of the key highlights that have happened so far from the work of the task force. One is around the advancement of alternative funding mechanisms in terms of providing for infrastructure investment, and obviously you will be aware of the work of the Housing Infrastructure Fund in Red Hills, but also the ongoing work around the Crown Investment Partners. And this is a really important thing to ensure that Auckland Council's balance book is not affected by the kind of investment we need in housing infrastructure, particularly in our greenfield areas. In terms of using the Auckland Housing Program and KiwiBuild to address one of the key concerns of the task force, which was about having an ongoing, consistent and reliable construction pipeline that enables the industry to invest in not only resources but also in technology. The council has been working with Housing New Zealand, HLC and also KiwiBuild to ensure that we use those 2 big housing programs to really create that pipeline, and the work that's been happening has been structure planning in Mount Roskill and Mangere, infrastructure delivery, and looking at how both of those areas, once that structure planning is completed, can be escalated in terms of the building of new houses. We're also working with those 3 entities on new ways of consenting, and all 3 of them have signed up to the qualified partners process under the building consenting department, which is a really great outcome for Auckland, because that means we have 3 very important entities saying to their construction deliverers that they are wanting a quality product and a quality process to make sure the building consent process is really efficient. We've also through this process put in our response to the National Policy Statement on Future Urban Development Capacity, and our response indicates that we have sufficient land supply to fill our obligations under that National Policy Statement, and the Mayoral Task Force generally agrees the issue in Auckland is not land supply, but it is housing supply. And so their focus has been very much on actions that help the construction industry, that help council be more efficient and effective in delivering houses on the ground, and the conversations have not been about the land supply issue. There's been continued advocacy by council and by taskforce members together and individually to Minister Salisa on the Building Act and the building code changes that are needed to streamline the building consent process, and also to remove some of the barriers to the use of things like overseas modular and prefab building systems. And we have also given feedback on 2 discussion documents put out by the Minister on the risk and liability issue in the construction process, and also on new product certification. And as you're aware, we've also been reporting back to the Planning Committee on new tenure and ownership models, which will look at things like how to enable more affordable housing for key workers. There's a report back later this year to the Planning Committee on that progress, and the chair of that committee has also had discussions with community housing providers on different models and approaches to aid that work. So I think that there is still work to do in this space. The key thing is with that advocacy to the central government, and some of those things that are not making the building construction system as efficient as possible. And certainly the work we've been advocating, the task force been advocating down to central government on the issues in the Building Act and the Building Code about modular housing, the liability issue, the new product certification, and providing for medium and high-rise density housing as an acceptable solution in the Building Act, all things that are really necessary if we are to see the work progress. And also the work in the procurement and contracting. So that's the space around helping the building industry ensure that when they procure and contract for the big projects, that there is an understanding about the risk and issues that they maintain. So good progress being made in a lot of areas. We've landed some things, and the thing that's really important about this task force is that we have these highly influential people around the table working with the council and also working with central government to resolve these issues. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Penny, and just to endorse that the task force actually worked much better than I think those of us that are on the task force might have hoped, in that you did get a group of key people from right across the sector, and now even more than before, central government players, to have the discussion that needs to take place to recognise the housing crisis that Auckland has faced, and to look at constructive options for addressing that crisis. We've made a lot of progress, as you've said. We still have a lot of work to do. I think that summary that you've given us is very helpful. Let's start off with questions first before comments. So I have a number of calls. I presume they're for questions. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Penny, you've given a very quick and concise profile of the work that's been done to date, and you've elaborated on some of the work that the council has done. So I'd like a bit more indication of what's actually working in that space and what we have the indicators to show that, if you do have that to hand. And the issues we have with the Building Act code, brands, ownership options and risk profiles that would seem to be come up against not a brick wall but a semi-impermeable membrane at MB that needs to be moved quicker. Do you have any comments about how we can progress that with a greater degree of, I can't think of the right word, enthusiasm might be the way?
In terms of the things that we've seen happening on the ground, if you like, or in terms of completed actions, you know, I think the alternative funding mechanism is a really important one for Auckland. If everybody around this table is aware of the infrastructure investment that's needed to enable our future urban areas to actually progress and be built as they are required to be built for housing and communities. And the work that has been done by Auckland Council on the Housing Infrastructure Fund to enable the Red Hills area to be funded partly by that fund, and also the work that's continuing with the Crown Investment Partners is a really important milestone for Council. The other things that I think are on the ground is the work that we're doing around the Auckland Housing Program. We do have now a process in place where we have a program where we're monthly meeting with Housing New Zealand and HLC, and KiwiBuild has now been part of that process, where we're getting we're working through the issues of ensuring that we've got the structure planning happening at pace, but that has to be aligned with infrastructure delivery, where we actually do have the ability to go ahead with the consenting process, working through, as I've said, the Qualified Partner Program, which puts an onus also on Housing New Zealand and HNC and now KiwiBuild, that they put in quality applications so that we can turn them around quickly. We are talking to them about an alternative resourcing model so that they get a dedicated team from Auckland Council that enables that work to happen more efficiently. And, you know, just looking some of the figures that we've had in terms of, at the moment we're averaging around 33 resource consents per month for Housing New Zealand developments across the isthmus, which is quite much higher than it has been in the past. And obviously that doesn't count the houses, that's the number of resource consents. And equally we've had over 120 building consents just out of the Auckland Housing Program, and once again that's not the number of houses. You know, quite often there are about 10 or more houses in each building consents. So we're starting to see the actual product being built on the ground, and as you'll probably be aware, there's 13 confirmed KiwiBuild sites now happening in Auckland and more coming in the pipeline. So the more that we work together with those three entities, the more we'll actually see the product on the ground, which I think is the aspiration of the task force. And in terms of your query about the Building Act and the Building Code, you know, I think both the task force and the Auckland Council have been very clear to the Ministry and to Minister Salisa about the four areas of concern to us. One is the liability issue, which currently it's joint and several, which means, as we have experienced with the leaky building situation, that Auckland Council tends to be the last person standing, and we would rather a risk and liability process which places the risk with the party at the time, so the designer, the builder, and of course Council needs to shoulder some risk and liability, but not the whole thing. We think that will drive a better quality product, because if every point along the way people have a liability or risk, they're going to ensure they've got better quality assurance processes in place to do that. So that's one area. The other area is about, you know, the delivery of KiwiBuild of 5,000 houses a year, more in Auckland alone a year, will only ever happen if we have modular and prefabricated systems. While we're comfortable with New Zealand products and we can make sure that they are quality products, internationally bought in prefab and modular is an issue for us, because we can't test whether or not they meet the building code. And so that's one of the issues we've raised. How can we get a standardised system for New Zealand that gives quality assurance about those internationally bought in prefab modular systems? The third area is around new product certification. Every time a new product comes on the market, every BCA in New Zealand, and there's about 60 of us, has to sign off individually whether or not that new product meets the building code. Very hard for the smaller councils. It takes a lot of our time as the largest council, and we think there needs to be a centralised system. And then the last area is that the Building Act, because of its age, and the building code does not recognise that medium density multi-storey development is now the norm in a place like Auckland, and we need acceptable models that we don't need to do a lot of testing around when they come to council, and issues around fire safety and acoustic protection and amenity for those developments need to be factored into that. So those are consistent messages that Auckland Council and the Mayoral Task Force members have been giving the Ministry for some time now. As I said, they put out a discussion document on the liability and the new products thing back in September, October, which we responded to, and we responded to in coordination with Christchurch City Council and Wellington City Council. I suppose our worry is that the speed of the change of these things is almost going to happen after the effort that we have to put in at the moment, and you know, my building consent team cannot be less risk averse because we have the liability issue hanging over us, and that's a cost to our ratepayer. We could be less risk averse and more efficient, taking less time on things if some of these issues were addressed more quickly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Good questions.
Yep.
Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Penny, for your presentation. Worship, I've got about half a dozen questions. I've been through it fairly thoroughly. If I could just run through them, they're fairly brief. Just picking up on your comment there, Penny, that the organisation. I just want to clarify you mentioned that we've seen this as more as a building supply of housing issue rather than a land supply issue, and has that position been taken by the organisation or the task force or the governing or the politicians? Just to clarify, who's come to that conclusion, who's taken that position?
So in the conversations at the Mayoral Task Force, there was a conversation about what are the key challenges that Auckland needs to focus on, what are the priorities, and land supply was not in the mind of the task force the priority to focus on. It was those other things I talked about.
Right, okay, thank you for clarifying that. I just missed your comment on it. I'm just in terms of the Auckland plan, us being satisfied that the Auckland plan's aligned with the national policy statement around capacity, what would be our comment around the delivery of the number of code of compliances that we're getting issued versus what we actually need to deliver? Are they related in any way?
So the national policy statement's requirements are a requirement about councils ensuring that they've got future land supply capacity for expected projected population needs, both for housing and for employment opportunities. And that looks out at different scenarios, and sorry, to be honest, I can't remember quite what those scenarios are. So that's about, do we have enough land that's either zoned or identified to be zoned for urban uses in the future? The question you're talking about is that in the past and recently there's commentary around really to provide enough houses for the growing Auckland population. We need to be delivering around 15,000 houses a year. It's probably more than that, to be honest now, but that's the figure that's been used. If you look at the reports that are sent out monthly by our research and monitoring unit, which is the monthly housing report, what that will be indicating to you is the number of CCCs that have been consented. And that gives you a feel of really a certificate of compliance tells you that a house has actually been finished. If you just look at the building consent process numbers, some of those might never be built. So if you look at the numbers that we've been issuing in October, we're up to around, I think, sorry, I just have to check the figures.
The CCCs in the last year are 10,139,
10,000,
which is buildings actually completed. The consents, which run ahead of the CCCs, are up to just under 13,000, and that's a record level, highest level ever.
Yeah, and it's a good trend there. I think you've answered the question. I was just trying to see how much the government was looking. Were they more worried about land capacity going forward versus the actual numbers that we're getting built. That was, and I think you've answered that.
Yeah, the national policy statement is very much about capacity.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And just around the consenting made easy process, just for clarification, the reports, and you've mentioned about the qualified partner service and the digital lodgement application, things like that. The figures around does that program, the consenting made easy program, include the numbers of consents that we're trying to achieve? You know, both notified and non-notified. Is that part of that? Is that the outcome of that program, or is it a little bit? Is that slightly separate from within the framework of that program? My impression is that consenting made easy is trying to get the numbers through. I just wanted to clarify it because it didn't mention in the report.
So the Consenting Made Easy program is about how can we get more efficient and effective consenting. And so it's offering those 4 different pathways: qualified, standard, premium and streamline. The aim of all of that is to give better customer service to the applicant. Obviously, if we can give better customer service and make the process more effective and efficient, for those building consents and resource consents that relate to new buildings, that will help that process. We also, obviously, it depends on the industry's ability to actually have the capacity to build more houses. So we can't increase the number of building consents being lodged, but we can certainly make sure that the time taken to process them and then the time taken to inspect them as they're being built is as effective and efficient as possible.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I thought that was the gist of it. Just a couple more questions, Your Worship. We talk about the housing supply and affordability around Maori in the report under the the impact statement for Maori there, and that how they're disproportionately affected by affordability. It was clause number 35 there, and it's got some statistics in there. About 32% of the homeless population are Maori. Unfortunately, quite highly represented. Do you know the source of that information, Penny? Where we could. It just didn't refer to the source. Do we know that, or could you get that to us?
I will get that to you.
Right, thank you. And I think probably, what was my final question here?
I can come back to you, Councillor, if that's helpful later. If you discover where the last question's got to.
I found it.
Oh, you found it. Good.
Yeah, sorry.
Good. Proceed, please.
Thank you very much. On this, the report mentions about the meeting we had on the 2nd of October, and we're going to develop a report back about the affordability, housing affordability. During that debate, I mentioned about the possibility of referring to some research around the Productivity Commission, the New Zealand Initiative, the New Zealand Infrastructure trip that they did to the United States, those reports. Are you in a position to comment, if it's coming through your team, if that is being looked at as part of the preparation of that report?
It's not coming through my team. It's Katarana Maki's team's writing there, but she was here for that discussion, and I'm sure she's taken on board the questions and comments that have been made at that meeting.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Penny Hulse.
Thank you. First of all, a bouquet, and well done getting this up and running, Mr Mayor, and I think the clarity that this has achieved is commendable, particularly the clarity around key advocacy points like the Building Act. But my question is around the UDA and the setting up of this new sort of super UDA. And the reason why I'm questioning that is on page 15 of our risk register, it does talk about Crown initiatives and Crown changes, and I think the two here kind of collide. And I'm just wondering, is the task force the right place, or could the task force be the right place on behalf of Auckland, not just Auckland Council but Auckland, to help mediate and moderate some of the concerns that we might have about the UDA, and to unpack that a little bit, the intersect between what the UDA intends to do and some of the practicalities that the UDA throws up for developers, community and council. It's quite hard to have those conversations directly, and I guess my hope is that do you think it might be useful, perhaps I should ask the Mayor rather than Penny, do you think, Mr Mayor, it might be useful to utilise the breadth of talent that you've got in your Housing Task Force to help moderate that discussion?
Yeah, I think it would be useful. Clearly, the government's or the minister's views on this won't always align with those of council, though he has proven to be very approachable and very cooperative in that. We've used the task force in other meetings with the minister to explain. I think Penny gave a presentation before the minister to explain how we see that process. But what you've got with the Housing Task Force is there's a wide range of people, including, I think, some of our best and some of our biggest developers, and our local council team, plus the central government agencies, and to have that discussion within that forum, I think, would be helpful, though the minister has to balance what he can say that might not yet have been determined by Cabinet with providing us with that information. I think the more open discussions will happen when he's tabled the legislation. We know exactly what we're talking about, and then we will have our own views about how that might need to be amended or altered to fit the reality on the ground, which our people are very familiar with, perhaps more so than the central government might be. So I think the short answer to your question is yes, when they've come out with that plan, having a Housing Task Force roundtable discussion on it, I think would be useful. But there are other tools that we'll be using, obviously, as well as making submissions to the Select Committee and so on.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I think that's really, really important, because the Housing Task Force has the ability to be a sensible and well-informed voice for Auckland in a way that I don't think Wellington are used to having access to. The Deputy Mayor made the good point about, at the moment, there's a semi-permeable membrane through which information can transfer to MB and other places that have not shown any interest previously in any of this. So I again commend the opportunity that this provides. Thank you. Just my last question. So what I didn't quite understand the report. We're dismantling some bit and some bits carrying on. Mayoral Task Force carries on, the reference group doesn't. What is the
the steering here? The steering group doesn't carry on, but the task force as a broad forum does. And so too do the working groups that rather than, we've got 3 hours, we've got top chief executives at it. We're asking a lot to have their time. We could spend a whole day on it, but instead we've divided it up into particular task forces which look at specific aspects and report back. Gotcha. We will be looking at the next Mayoral Task Force meeting in March we continually look at how we go forward. You don't keep a body in existence forever. We keep it in existence for as long as people attending that body find it to be useful. And they do find it to be useful because I think, Bill, we just had a full turnout a week or a fortnight ago. So the view of the task force members will help drive what the ongoing role of that task force will be. But at this stage, we're looking at how we might evolve that, how we might have more regular presentations by the relevant ministers at it. We now have active involvement from central government, which the former minister wasn't that keen on. Now they are there, they're fully engaged. Doesn't mean to say that they always agree with what we are thinking, but at least we can throw our ideas at them and they can take them on board, if that's helpful. Okay, Councillor Wayne Walker.
Yeah, got a few questions stroke comments. So I've had a look at the
so should we keep it to questions first, because I'll open it up for comments in a minute.
In which case I'll deal with it by way of question. So I look at the spreadsheet around recommendations and upcoming actions. Is it possible to have some assignment of responsibility around who deals with the particular action? For example, there may be an action that is a council action, there may be an action that is a government action and it may be a particular part of government, so that we've got a clear idea of responsibility. So that's one question, and that
Shall
just
we
goes
take
to
them one
the
at a
format.
time? Penny?
I'm certainly looking forward, when we report back to the governing body, we can look at that. I do think, though, that sometimes these issues are not so clear-cut, and it's a number of parties are needed to be involved in actually achieving these actions. So where it is clear, we'll be able to indicate that, but quite often it requires the combined effort of both council, central government and the private industry to achieve these outcomes, and we'll have to say that then.
Okay, and the other question that just goes to the format, and I understand that you got a number of recommendations, 1 through to, what do we got, 23, 32 or so. Is it possible to have some identification of priorities across those recommendations?
I think, Councillor Walker, it might be useful if you refer back to the original Mayoral Housing Task Force, because this obviously is just a snapshot of what the issues were, but that was very clear on what what were the priorities, but also these were the priority actions, all of them, that came out of the task force conversations. And as I've said, many of them are intertwined. But I think it might be helpful, and perhaps we should have attached the original report just to refresh people's minds about what was the background to it. So take that on board as a comment for next time.
And my last question is, if we've identified that there's a particular block, and there may be a quantum of effort required to deal with that block, it could be some legislative change or the like, is it possible to identify how much time it might take to deal with that block? That is, if it requires some government legislation, what's a timeline on that, so that somebody can pick this up and they can see, oh gee, this is a priority. Oh, who's responsible? It's the government. How much time is involved? How quickly could this happen? So that we've got something that applies a maximum amount of pressure where it can be applied.
I think that would be a challenging thing to do, because obviously it's not our timeline in terms of any legislative change that is needed. Certainly we can talk to representatives from central government who are on the task force to see if that's achievable, but I suspect you'd get such a general kind of indication that it wouldn't be very helpful. But we can look at that.
Thank you very much. As soon as possible is probably the short answer, but we don't set the timeline for the government reporting on these issues. They have indicated in areas like the building code that next month is when they were due to present a report, but there's often slippage, and that's in their responsibility.
And I've got one last question. Obviously, a lot of this goes to evidence and numbers. Does our council employ any statistician or the like to crunch numbers and engage with government statisticians so that we've got a common agreement on data?
So as you know, we have a highly regarded research and investigation and monitoring unit, which sits under an Auckland Plan and Strategy department. That works very closely with Stats New Zealand to ensure that the data that we use is consistent with other parts of government, and also we have an Auckland monitoring group that ensures that how data is used by various government departments in Auckland Council and our CCOs is done in a consistent manner. And of course we also are lucky enough to have the chief economist as well, who can then take that data and do the kind of analysis that's needed to give the evidence for some of this work.
Thank you. Councillor Richard Hills.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the update. I just wanted a question on so the unitary plan was obviously designed to create more dwelling space for within the RUP. And what is the total? So obviously seeing a huge increase in consents in around the transport corridors and within the town centres and metropolitan areas. What is the total dwelling kind of space or availability for the next sort of 10 to 15 years, do you expect?
That will have been in that the report that we did for the National Policy Statement. I don't have it with me, but I can make sure that you get a copy, Councillor Hills.
Yeah, it's just mostly on the fact that, yeah, people keep thinking it's maybe about the availability of land, but often the dwelling numbers, we can fit a much higher within the brownfields.
If we look at, when the unitary plan was finalised and the report that came out of the independent hearings panel at that time, the market feasible capacity within the existing urban area of Auckland was around, I think it was around 250,000 more houses. The actual theoretical capacity in Auckland is well over the million houses mark. If you just look at the residential zones, if you include all the town centres and mixed-use zones where you can also build houses, that takes the theoretical capacity up to 2 million. So it's somewhere between the two, because market feasibility is about what the market at this very point in time thinks is feasible. The theoretical will never be built because it means every possible site that could be redeveloped will be redeveloped, but it's somewhere in the middle, and that's why the issue is more about how can we help the industry build not only more houses, but the kind of houses we want in Auckland, which are robust, safe, healthy, sustainable houses.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Bartley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm looking at the recommendation 1 about scaling up, the joint venture building program. I'm looking at, just the boom that's happening with the developments, and I'm wondering, where is the political oversight in this? I know you've got the task force, but if I look at the learnings from the first regeneration program in Tamaki, we don't have an effective mechanism for political oversight there. So to scale it up, how are we making sure that we're learning from that and that we do have some political oversight over all this development that's happening in the different areas?
So political oversight in terms of the development of land happens at different times. The unitary plan and the zoning of these areas for more intensive development was where a large part of that oversight was given. When we talk about individual pieces of land that are being developed in accordance with the unitary plan, unless there is a need for a plan change or for a resource consent that's publicly notified, there is no political oversight there. It is just the way that development happens, because the political oversight happens at the development of the planning documents. In terms of the big Auckland housing programs, obviously they're driven by the ministries that have oversight over Housing New Zealand and HLC and KiwiBuild, but we work closely as officers, and where they would be looking to change things that were not in accordance with the unitary plan through a plan change, then that would be brought back to the planning committee for political oversight from the council.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Should we now move on to general comments, if we can try to keep those reasonably succinct, if there may be that you've made your points in your questions. Councillor Newman.
Yeah, thank you. And Penny, I do want to commend you for this, but I just want to make a couple of comments. You don't need to respond to me because it's not about you actually. It's about the state. Who is the single largest residential property owner in Auckland? It is the state through Housing New Zealand. Who has the deepest, strongest, most robust balance sheet? it's a New Zealand taxpayer. Who sought the fast track process and who benefited from that? Well, it was the state, and Housing New Zealand, as the submitter, sought the most permissive rules for development and redevelopment in the unitary plan. It has benefited from the special housing areas, the Hashar legislation. It is seeking the freeing up of public land, and it is benefiting from the speeding up of infrastructure. So going to what the question that Councillor Hulse raised around the UDA, my question would be, what more does the state want? What more does Housing New Zealand want that it hasn't already got? It's actually received quite a lot of benefit in terms of planning and infrastructure and the certainty around those things. So I commend the Mayoral Housing Task Force and the recommendations, but it seems to me that the only thing that is left to do is the one thing that the state ought to be doing, and that is de-risking local government around these developments. Housing New Zealand, I would suggest, aren't a particularly good manager of some of their most difficult tenancies. They already freeload off the community by not providing 240 litre wheelie bins for their 3-bedroom tenancies in South Auckland. And I don't see anything coming through this which gives me confidence that there is a willingness from the state to actually to ensure its product and take the risk off local government. And until it does that, I think proclamations from the Minister around addressing the housing shortage with the UDAs will amount to not very much, because they've actually got everything that they wanted, and they haven't given a lot back to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Worship. I can't support this item today because Auckland's house affordability is a basket case, and that's really a reflection, I think, on the brief of this task force, which it gave itself, which was to build more houses at pace and at scale. Auckland's captured in a housing affordability crisis from which it seems to be unable to escape. And I think the bulk of this blame actually rests on the shoulders of Auckland Council, in particular around its restrictive planning, around its over-regulated consenting processes, and its poor performance, as was identified by the Auditor General in this year's audit report. I think the task force has failed to identify the primary levers that Auckland Council itself can use to fix the Auckland housing crisis. I think the report is useful, but I think it could have been far more productive, Your Worship, if the terms of reference had been tighter and focused on exactly what steps the Auckland Council could take itself immediately to fall in these runaway housing inflated prices in Auckland. So really, it's really just a simple supply and demand situation. We have a lack of housing, of land supply at affordable price, and land's being choked. So I unfortunately have to disagree with the position that the task force has taken, that it's not a land supply issue. I noticed every one of the 6 work streams, Your Worship, in the paper all require central government intervention. So it's pretty hard for council to do things that it needs to do if it's relying on intervention from central government. And this is what I get. This brings me back to the point that I believe is probably at the crux of the issue here, and that's that the lack of political will around this table to take ownership or full ownership of the housing affordability crisis that Auckland's in, allowing the task force to call for action outside of what Auckland Council could control itself has created a high likelihood that nothing will change. And that's exactly what has happened. Auckland still remains highly unaffordable. So dealing with the housing crisis, I believe, is Auckland Council's #1 moral issue. It's an imperative moral issue, the single most important issue moral issue that this council's facing. And I'm far from satisfied that the Auckland plan actually aligns with the government policy statement around capacity because of the current artificial restriction of land supply created by the rural-urban boundary, which is a council-created distortion of the market. It's a cruel and punishing regressive form of taxation because the poorer people are now having to spend more of their income on housing than those who are better off. Removal of the rural-urban boundary would provide a more competitive supply of land if supported by new infrastructure methods and if the unitary plan was modified to fit such a purpose. These are the types of solutions I believe that Auckland needs to implement to meet the needs of our growing population. So this report fails to tackle Auckland Council's restrictive planning around land supply and its highly or over-regulated and costly consenting processes. I think, Your Worship, the citizens of Auckland deserve a lot better treatment than this, and it's been served up in this Merrill report, and accordingly I won't be putting my vote behind it. I think citizens of Auckland deserve a lot better. Thank you.
Councillor Darby.
Look, I've just been listening to Councillor Sayers there, and I'm not sure who wrote that information that he's just been reading from, but it does sound like, you know, an agenda from somebody who would like to see Auckland sprawl from the Brynderwyns to the Bombays,
I wrote it.
a sea of rooftops for us all to walk across. It would be a great conveyor belt, wouldn't it, for the people of Northland to reach Hamilton. It's not a future that I see in my time or my children's time or my grandchildren's time in Auckland. And we, at the outset, Mayor, and at the beginning of this Merrill Housing Task Force, we did review a number of those discussions about land supply. And it was interesting having the industry around the table. This was not just about the council. Initially, it wasn't the government. There was a change of government, and then government did embrace the Merrill Housing Task Force, which was a great thing. But there was unanimity from those that are major housing developers that sat round the table that the issue was not about land supply, that the unitary plan and the future urban land supply made it very clear that there was an abundance of land, both brown and green, for redevelopment, and there was a plan in place. The unitary plan enabled phenomenal capacity never ever provided for prior, and then that was backed up by the 16 and then reviewed 2017 Future Urban Land Supply Strategy. I guess at the outset we did make one decision, Mr Mayor, which we need to come back to and address, and that is at the outset we wanted to focus on housing supply because we saw that as the most critical challenge. And I guess in my eyes, just as we were, you know, there was an awareness at government in 2008 and well before on the need to address affordability. For me, one of the most critical areas that we're going to have to pick up on now in the next stage is addressing affordability as it should have been addressed, you know, back in a different decade when legislation was repealed in 2009 and the SHAs were supposed to deal with affordability. That was primarily the government part of that agreement, and that was not delivered upon. And so it's this council that is going to have to lead addressing the affordability challenges for Aucklanders. But yeah, interesting to hear that that paper being read out. That's not what the evidence tells us. That is, without doubt, there's no evidence that there is shortage of land supply in Auckland. Not not a shred.
Thank you very much, Councillor, and thank you for your participation, active participation on the task force. Councillor Wayne Walker.
Sure. So I asked some questions earlier, and I got some answers to the questions. And in my comments, I just want to go back to those questions and reinforce some of my points as comments. And that is that it's pretty clear from looking at many of the task force recommendations that a lot of it sits with government. And frankly, I would have thought that much of it were relatively easy fixes, require some legislation. I would have hoped that that legislation could have been fast-tracked, and maybe some resourcing. And I'm referring particularly to the Building Act and the necessity to overhaul that, the manufactured building guidance, and it looks like the government's got manufactured building guidance and it's sitting on it and not releasing it. So why aren't they doing that? I mean, I would have thought that was pretty basic. Obviously there are issues around people that need to work in the space and visas. That's something that government needs to look at. Funding for infrastructure, also government. So my comment is the necessity to take these recommendations and do a bit more work on it. I really don't think we can wait for government to do that. We may need to do some of that work ourselves and really put the heat on. And picking up on the comments that Councillor Darby and others have made, I'm really disturbed that we have this urban development authority that's on the horizon when very clearly it's all of these other things that frankly are low-hanging fruit that the government needs to be addressing now. Just picking up on an item of news over the last day or so, which is around the number of teachers that are required, and it goes to my earlier point around data. Quite obviously, I would suggest a number of those teachers are going to be required in Auckland. I don't know how many there are. It would be interesting to know that. And how many houses, how much accommodation do those teachers need? And it disturbs me that on the one hand, the government is fast-tracking that. So it's fast-tracking a process where these people can come into the country, but there are all these other issues that equally the government should be fast-tracking and has been sitting on. So we can't have a situation where the government does one thing and not does the other. And I guess that goes to my question around having some data and some numbers so that we're in a position to put that out there, not just for the government, but also for people generally, so they can understand the problem. And I guess my last passing comment is it would be really good to express some of this conceptually in a picture so that it's easy enough for a member of the public to pick it up, to understand what the issues are, to have some of these things quantified so you can see what the fix is. Because frankly, I don't think too much of it is actually incredibly difficult. It requires some will and action.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I just want to focus in on one recommendation that the Housing Task Force has picked up, and that's to do with providing for innovation, particularly as it goes to prefabrication and medium density housing, because that's been an aspect that has disappointed me, particularly when you look at what happens with other countries overseas. The term housing crisis is bandied around quite regularly, but in some respects the response is not really that of reacting to a crisis. It's more a kind of a mild panic or variation of business as usual, and I certainly commend the task force for the amount of recommendations it's picked up, because we are the council. We don't build houses. Our role is limited. It is the government that really has to step up to the plate on that. And what I have found disappointing since the unitary plan is particularly what's happened with medium density housing or terraced housing, where the economies of scale were meant to suggest that by building more essentially of just the same building in rows of 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or whatever it might be, you're duplicating all manner of things on one plot or two plots of land, but the prices don't reflect that. If anything, they're disproportionately more expensive than even the single lot one. So if I go to any new housing development in my ward, and this is 2 years on since the unitary plan now, these kind of medium density terrace type houses are all sitting around 800, 900, 1.1, 1.2 million. So that hasn't resulted in the affordability quotient coming down, and I just wonder why we don't look at some of these other countries where they have faced genuine housing crisis more than we face. In fact, places like Chile, which at one point in the early 2000s they were building 100,000 houses a year, and a lot of them were in these kind of medium density terrace type housing constructions, and they were innovative, and I just wonder to what extent our building code, even though in Chile of course it's a country that's racked by frequent earthquakes and tsunamis, so structurally that the houses have to be quite strong. We haven't gone anywhere near the innovation that countries like that have come up. Yet we did have our own version of that in years gone by. So if you think back to the 1960s, we had these all around Auckland, these large-scale, we'd call cheap or affordable homes, Neil Arches type constructions, where we had a basic home that was built, and the occupier, the family, finished off over the course of time. They finished off the house, so the starting cost was very low. In Chile, they went a step further. They half finished the houses off. So they built houses that were half finished, but all the important parts of household living were there, like plumbing and shower and kitchen, but half the house was left unfinished. That means, as of the moment, around 2016-17, they're building these half houses for about $25,000. Admittedly, the local council, their version of it, and the government provide all the services and provide the land, but their building costs are incredibly low. Now, that sort of innovation, we're not seeing any sense of that at all in New Zealand to cope with the ongoing challenge, which is going to be price, and that's not just social housing, but that's for teachers, police, anyone, our children, anyone else actually getting a start. They're not going to get anywhere near raising an actual deposit to go to our versions of these terraced housing. So, Mr. Mayor, I would just say that I would certainly encourage in our advocacy, because it is advocacy, to be a little bolder, to be a little bit more innovative, to look at some of these other areas around the world, like Chile, where they have been incredibly successful, and they haven't had to go, from the Brynderwyns, down to Pukekohe. They have managed to do this in built-up urban areas as well. So I would certainly like to think that we can go back to the future in some ways and show a bit of that Kiwi ingenuity and come up with housing models, particularly this medium density type model, terrace type model, where we can really make a big difference to the price, therefore to the accessibility for housing, because in many respects that's going to be the real challenge going ahead for the next 3 decades.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cooper.
I guess a lot of it has been said since earlier comments, but I guess for me it's really clear that in this housing task force, Auckland Council has done its part that it said it would do. And I think that's very clear. So I do support it because we have done what we said we were going to do. And as several other people have said, it's really up to the government to do their part now and for MB to pull its weight, and especially around the Building Act. I mean, we've had that outlined to us that there's 3 or 4 issues around that. And Councillor Newman talked about the liability. That's why we're risk averse. Because the ratepayers, I mean, we've just added $82 million to our leaky building bill, and that's an open-ended cheque, that goes on for years, and that's one of the reasons why we are very careful. Not because we want to hold up things or not because we, just like being annoying. Really, we want to be risk averse because it sheets back home to the ratepayers. If we get it wrong, or even if we don't get it wrong, if the builders get it wrong, if anybody else gets it wrong, they just liquidate, take off, and it's left with us. And I think that's part of our fiscal responsibility as well, that we are careful around that. And as Mrs. Pirrett said, if we can share some of that liability, we'd create much more efficiency. And so I think, you know, so that's something I think I support this work. It's been a huge piece of work. It's still ongoing. We've still got to get there. But I certainly don't advocate for us freeing up land. You know, already people in Pokeno are using our services and not paying for them by, you know, paying in the rates. So we're already subsidising other regions, and we don't need to be doing that anymore. One of the other issues is, I mean, we opened up enough land for 400,000, over 400,000 homes in the unitary plan. And part of this task force wasn't to relitigate the unitary plan. That was the biggest, biggest thing we could have done, and we did it. And we did a really good balance between up and out. And I think, as shown, we're already building most of our building, a huge percentage of it is in the brownfields areas or in the inside the MUL. So there isn't a huge call for building outside of that. We've got a lot of stuff to fill up before we go out there. So I'm really pleased that we've played our part in this, and we still will continue to do that, and to always try and get better and better at what we do and find ways to convince the government they need to do their part. So thank you for the work done on this.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Penny-Hulse.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'm tempted to say what she said. I think Councillor Cooper put it beautifully, but because I'm a politician, I will amplify. I can't resist it. I did put my hand up to speak because I was going to ask Councillor Greg Sayers what the solutions were. He said the solutions are perfectly clear and we just need to get on, have the political will to do them. I realise I don't need to ask that question because I think Councillor Sayers was saying, and am I correct, Councillor Sayers, that simply opening up the RUB is the solution?
I think there's a few, and I'm happy to try and elaborate on those.
I am interested because it's a little bit, you know, everyone thinks there's one easy solution. What the Housing Task Force has done is understand the complexity and the interrelatedness of all of these issues. There is no simple solution. The last thing we need to do is open up the rural-urban boundary, and I was tempted to say, Councillor Sayers, I think the 60s have rung and asked for the speech back, but the rural-urban boundary is something that is utterly critical to our ability to manage our costs going into the future. The ratepayers of now and into the future can't afford to keep funding far-flung infrastructure. That is one of the most fundamental reasons why we have to control the rural-urban boundary. The other issue is, and Councillor Darby put it beautifully, we simply can't spread from Pokeno to, you know, to Whangarei and expect poor people to live on the outskirts of town. You know, again, that was the 60s and 70s did that, and we're still paying the social cost and the environmental and the cultural cost of retrofitting those mistakes. Thirdly, the environment can't afford this. You know, if we're going to deal with climate change, we can't keep flinging ourselves further and further out and expanding our boundaries further and further. I could go on about the rural-urban boundary, don't get me started, because, you know, it really is the most simplistic and ill-informed, and it is the biggest non-answer to the housing affordability issue that we face, and the sooner we put that to one side, the better. I just want to comment on one issue, that we've never had as many consents processed as we have now. We're building houses hand over fist. Council is doing, and I think Councillor Cooper put it well, we are doing our bit. We're doing everything we've said we would do. The things that are getting in the way, and just to say it again, because I don't think people have heard this, our ability to be less risk adverse is predicated on risk sharing with government. We cannot be more creative and do what they do in Chile because we simply can't do it under the law, and secondly, we can't put our ratepayers at financial risk until the government comes to the party and shares that risk. And the last thing is, some of the biggest challenges we face are the way that the banking industry works, the way that development is financed, the timing and the availability of the building industry to fund and physically get these buildings out of the ground needs to be addressed as well. And that's one of the biggest opportunities we've got that I think comes out of the Housing Task Force as well, is looking at employment and employment opportunities and opening that pipeline, establishing that pipeline, getting our young people employed and making the most of the opportunities that this presents us. So I would love councillors to actually get behind this. You know, if we are talking genuinely of political will to engage in making a difference, building affordable housing and building a good Auckland, for God's sake, the answers and the way forward are in here. It's very easy to stand to one side and throw rocks at this, but that's not going to progress us. So again, Mr. Mayor, happy to endorse and support this. Let's, for God's sake, get on and build Auckland and stop carping on about small and inconsequential issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Councillor Lee.
Thank you. I've been listening to the discussion with a lot of interest. I think there are a number of features about the Auckland market that we should bear in mind. But first of all, I would say that in terms of the unitary plan, while the headline and a lot of the focus was on intensification and compactity and so on, brownfields development, it did entail a massive increase in urbanisation into previously rural land. So that is a fact that can't be contested. But in terms of the interesting features about Auckland, New Zealand, but Auckland in particular, first of all, a free market in land with some recent restrictions, but essentially the whole world is in the market for Auckland land, which puts a lot of pressure on the price. Secondly, and conversely, a highly protected construction sector. So especially in building materials, which again acts to put pressure upwards on the price. Quite a remarkable contrast. And then, of course, policies of previous governments, apparently including the present one, and certainly the Council, of high population growth in Auckland. So in terms of the task force, which has kind of military overtones of getting in there, getting the job done effectively, even ruthlessly, I suspect unless the government is willing to tackle those distortions in the Auckland market, the task force will be meeting for many, many years to come, and we'll be talking about it for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Stewart.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Just very interested listening to all of this. The unitary plan, as you know, I was one of the councillors that didn't really support a lot of the unitary plan, and just listening to, you know, we're talking about responsibility. We've got the leaky houses. It's now a problem. We've now, with the unitary plan, what I can see, especially in my community, I can see with the unitary plan is causing a lot of problems with the infill housing, and we're trying to say that there's affordable housing out in Hauck and Pakuranga and the Botany area. Well, that'll never be affordable. But we have a problem now with the climate change and many parts of where my community live, and with flooding. We have people that are still not even living in their homes since the flood of the 11th of April this year. I think we have to be really, really careful. What I think we should have really done is I think with the unitary plan we should have really, at the very beginning, at the very start, we should have actually encouraged the water care, the Auckland Transport and the Healthy Water people to be very much part of the planning of this unitary plan, and they were a little bit later in the piece, but I'm just really, really concerned, and I think with the task force, the message has to really go out there that if we do have areas that we know that there are some really serious flooding issues where people's lives and their livelihoods are just being taken away, it's all very well saying that we've got, when we have infill housing going into the brownfield areas, that the infrastructure is going to be is going to fix, and it's going to fix all the problems. But that's not happening when we have development contributions going in. That's for the water and you know, people aren't connecting. It's all very well saying that all of this housing affordability and all the new infrastructure that's supposedly going in there is going to fix all the problems of housing in Auckland, but it certainly isn't, and I can see it out in my community. There's many people that have had, that they're not getting insured for their homes now, so we're talking about the leaky houses, that's come back to bite, and I think the flooding is definitely going to come back to bite. So I think, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. If there are no other calls, I just want to, sorry, Councillor Filipaina and Councillor Cashmore.
Thank you, Your Worship. Look, I you know, this piece of work, and I just want to congratulate everybody around the task force. That has been a long journey for us since 2010 around the housing issue. Just want to acknowledge everybody there. Also want to acknowledge the people who are around this table, and Penny, your leadership in the early stages, and also the court hearings, the hearings with the independent Unitary Plan Auckland independent panel. Just want to acknowledge there, but you know, Your Worship, it was actually interesting. Councillor Holst led it through first term, second term, the hearings, and I just want to acknowledge the people, but especially our CCOs, who have been in the beginning, the middle, and the end of the Unitary Plan process, and they will continue to be there across the region, because it is important. It is important in regards to now getting on around the table and with the task force, with central government, with all our developers, with people that are interested in housing. So, you know, I just wanted to let the councillors know that there have been a lot of discussion over the last 7-8 years, and there will still be discussions moving forward around the issue that has been highlighted since the Auckland Council came into term. So, you know, Your Worship, I just wanted to acknowledge the people and really, yeah, Penny, you and your team in the Unitary Plan, and also the team now that reports to the Planning Committee under Councillor Darby and Hills. So thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and it was an honour to be part of this panel. There's an old saying, you know, joined up we're strong, individually we're weak, or we fail. And where this council, through this housing task force, I think has had a big win, is that we've partnered up and listened to people who have got serious skin in the game.
Of course.
Whether that's developers of varying scales, or social housing providers, or the construction sector, economists, getting the views around the table. They didn't always agree, and there were some fairly heated arguments, but the fact those people stuck through those meetings for half a day each time, participated, and are willing to continue to do so, speaks volumes of the worthwhileness they see of this work. The task force does not stand alone. It is working alongside the rules of the Unitary Plan, and the task force members supported those rules. They understand that having endless sprawl from Hamilton to Whangarei is not only unaffordable, it's a social disaster. They completely get that, and these are the people who do the constructions. They understand they need to build communities where people not only live, but work, socialise and educate their children. Communities. The Future Urban Land Supply Strategies allocated 18,000 hectares of greenfields through the Unitary Plan. It enables 423,000 dwellings to be built in theory. 40% of the growth will be outside the urban area, but 70% inside. You think that adds up to 110%. It's because that's the float. That's the float. Some of the things have progressed well. Consenting was identified early on as a problem in this council, and I commend Ms Pruitt on her work with consenting made easy and driving change. And we're now at record numbers of consenting, as the Mayor has said, and CCCs processed and issued. It's not perfect yet, but it's a work in real progress that is measurable and meaningful. Several councils have identified the work that has to be done with the Crown. Personally, I do not see any point at standing on the side and just throwing rocks at the Crown. We need to work collaboratively with whoever's in government. We worked with National last term, and we're working with Labor right now. It's not about political preference, it's about delivery. And if we are going to change the Building Act and the Code, we're going to alter the risk profile, if we're going to increase more people in the industry, we need to work with the Crown. Together, we are strong. The skills need to be uplifted. The Crown needs to have a solid undertaking to build through financial dips. The industry can't go from boom to bust. That's just destructive for all concerned. The risk profile I mentioned must be changed. We need to investigate the models of ownership, and the Crown has undertaken the first stages of working with us. People might be able to buy a share in a house or have a long-term 99-year ownership lease, but it's intergenerational. There are other models that we can use and investigate and use in this country. And lastly, Mr Mayor, I think we have to have a good, strong challenge at the financial instruments that are available to better enable more ownership by more people in more varied circumstances. There's not one single easy answer, as Councillor Hulse says. There never has been and never will be. The simple platitudes of expansion and it's all to do with consenting are just that, simple platitudes. This is a complex, diverse, and not an easy to solve issue. It's been over a generation in the builders' housing crisis. Hopefully it won't take anywhere near that amount of time to resolve. And with the record consenting and CCCs, maybe we are starting to make good progress on the 30 to 35,000 shortfall that currently exists and impacts so hard on so many Aucklanders. So, Mr Mayor, the Housing Task Force will reform, it'll become more focused, have a new set of goals and challenges. And again, we'll work collaboratively and keep working amongst the industry and also with the Crown to deliver the changes that needs be. I would personally like to thank all the members who are on that task force for their work, their time, their knowledge and their enthusiasm. And I guess above all I would say enthusiasm, because they did believe in the process. It was work well done.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. If I can just make some comments in summary before we vote on the recommendation. First, to acknowledge both Chris Darby and Bill Cashmore as active members of the task force, and thank you for your input, and Penny and your team. For anybody that thinks that Council hasn't been relentless in promoting the issues to central government, where central government has the responsibility, needs to look at the flow of correspondence and in particular Penny's really continual pressure that these are the areas that need to change to facilitate a solution to the problem. I want to be reasonably positive about this. I think the first positive thing that has happened over the last 2 years is that the crisis, and it is a crisis in housing, has been recognised. There was a long period of denial, when we were building 2,000 or 3,000 houses a year and we were increasing our population by 30 to 40,000 people. And we watched those statistics get steadily worse. We watched housing prices go up by 15, 16, 17% a year. We watched homelessness getting relentlessly worse. And I think we're starting to turn that around. And I'm saying that not because I'm a born optimist, but because I've looked at the figures. We hit in the year to October just under 13,000 resource consents issued. Look back 5 years and it was around 2,000 to 3,000. Look at the CCCs, the Code of Compliance Certificates, and we signed off over 10,000. That's actually houses built. And you'd have to be blind not to go around Auckland and see the sheer level of development that's happening.
and to see the absolute commitment that we're now getting, particularly working with central government to resolve some of the problems that are there. Is there a simple solution? No. Is wisdom all in one place? No. Why did we set up the task force? Because of course it made sense. I can't understand why it hadn't happened before, to have all of the players, the key players, together around the same table, looking at the problem and exploring solutions to that problem. And we've got central government there and absolutely committed now. We've got ourselves there as council, absolutely committed. We've got the key people in the private sector, the developers, the people like the Housing Foundation, the bankers. They're working out the solutions. And I'm really pleased when I look at not only the consents that we are issuing, but I also look at where those consents are happening. And I thought John Watson raised some good points about you know, the need to focus on the multi-unit developments, because that's a critical part of it. But I've got to tell you that 53% of the resource consents in the last year have been for multi-unit developments and apartments. Councillor Darby probably knows the figures, but it's way over what we were a while ago. What percent of consents are going into the urban limits? It's 83% on the old 2010 metropolitan urban limit. We are doing exactly what I want to acknowledge again Penny Hulse, because she did a fantastic job on the Auckland Unitary Plan against some massive odds. But we are intensifying the housing. And yes, Councillor Stewart's quite right too. That does create some problems, and we shouldn't be blind to the problems that are being created. One of the critical problems, of course, is transport. Why do we need light rail through Mount Roskill and Mangere? Because thousands, literally thousands, of extra houses are being built there in the next few years, and the prerequisite to building a house is to make sure you've got an infrastructure transport system that can cope with that growth. Even what we're doing in the quarry in Three Kings, how are we going to get those extra thousands of people in there unless we've got a transport system that copes? One of the problems that we faced was our debt to revenue ratio, and I'm really pleased that the government has been flexible on that. The last government helped us with the Housing Infrastructure Fund, but that didn't affect our debt to revenue ratio. In a couple of weeks' time, we will be moving on what we've discussed around this table in a number of workshops with the Crown Infrastructure Partners to start utilising money for infrastructure that will not be on our books and will not damage our debt to revenue ratio. And we have to do that. And I know the regional fuel tax causes pain, but where were we going to find the $4.3 billion that we needed for things like roading and infrastructure to build those houses? If you don't have the money, it doesn't happen. So we have been actively exploring alternative funding so that we can build the infrastructure, so that we can build the houses. And, you know, yes, Councillor Darby's right. You know, the Future Urban Land Supply Scheme is there. There are hundreds of thousands of properties that are being zoned, but unless you've got the infrastructure, it doesn't happen. So our task force focused on the supply side, but there is a demand side as well. One of our problems was that last year, or just over a year ago, we hit a record level of growth in the city. And one of the things that we needed to ease was demand, and the demand in part was international migration into Auckland. That has come down by 13% from its peak in the last year, and that takes a bit of pressure off. And fortunately, the government has exempted those people that are part of the solution, not part of the problem, the people coming in to help in the building industry. But we've got to help with our own people too. And I want to acknowledge the work Richard Hills has done in the past in work skills and youth connections. 500 or 600 young people have been facilitated into the building trades, and we need to do more of that. We need to do more of the innovation work. When I went up to Hobsonville the other day with Fletcher's, they built 5 houses in 5 days. And it was, Councillor Watson, what you were talking about, it was the prefabrication, that was the modular housing, and it was also affordable housing, and affordable in inverted commas, because affordability is a real question in Auckland. Let me touch on affordability. From going from 15% growth in house prices a year, according to our own valuations, we're hitting less than 1% now. It's a double-edged sword. We don't want property values to fall so quickly that people have negative equity, but we do want property prices to stabilise and come down a bit so that it is affordable. But we need to do more, as we've talked about around this table, with inclusionary zoning, and we're starting to tackle that issue as well. So for the doomsayers to say nothing has changed, nothing is happening, couldn't be more wrong. Couldn't be more wrong. This task force has played a constructive role, and we will continue to put pressure on in the areas that Penny outlined, like liability, like the new building code and a new building act, and product certification, so you don't have 60 different housing authorities each having to confirm that that new product meets the standard. That's crazy. That's duplication. That's wastage. It's time consuming. It brings inconsistencies. So my short comment at the end is to say I think the task force has been successful. I think that we're starting to make some real progress. Are we there yet? No, we're nowhere near there yet. We've got to keep the pressure on. We've got to keep focused on this issue. Because the one thing I did agree with Councillor Sayers on was that this is our key challenge in Auckland. To get housing back to affordability, one way of doing that is to increase the supply so it matches demand, but there are a range of other things that we've got to do to intervene in a constructive and positive way, and I welcome the relationship with government that enables us to make that progress. So it is a work in progress, but we are moving forward, we are making a difference. I'll end up with the figure again from our work with Housing First. Really proud that in 18 months we have housed 700 people that were living in emergency housing or on the streets or in cars. 700 people in 18 months, and that's been a joint effort between the NGOs, who have that absolute commitment there, local government, where we're facilitating that process, and central government that provides the funds. Less money on creating emergency motel accommodation, more money in finding permanent solutions. But I think we can be proud of what we've achieved, but we need to be relentless in pressing on to continue to make those achievements. Now, the resolution for today's paper is a very simple one. It is to note the update on progress of the Mayoral Housing Task Force. That's been moved, I think.
Moved and seconded, yes.
Moved and seconded, myself and Deputy Mayor Cashmore. I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
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 To the contrary, no.
No, Your Worship, if I could have it noted.
Yep. I declare that carried overwhelmingly.